Okay, hi everybody, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for this afternoon's Lunch and Learn presentation with Professor Lauren Simpson. This has been organized by HYLA's Generation Generosity Committee. My name is Anietie Akpan. I'm a member of the Generation Generosity Committee, and we're really excited about being able to have this time with Professor Simpson, who really just has such a passion and heart for ecology and conservation. And this will be a great way to sort of discuss ways to get involved in those spaces as we usher in spring. As lawyers and as future lawyers, because I know we have some law students from South Texas watching this afternoon as well, we're called to serve through pro bono representation, volunteering to advance our profession, and striving to improve our community. But one impactful way to serve our community starts at home, and that's by supporting pollinators and other wildlife in our home landscapes and local green spaces. And so that's what we'll be talking about today for this presentation, serving our community by supporting pollinators at home, which will be presented by Professor Lauren Simpson, who's with us today. Since early 2015, Professor Simpson has transformed her home gardens into a wildlife-friendly habitat, currently a certified wildlife habitat, monarch way station, and certified butterfly garden. She promotes insect conservation and habitat gardening through presentations such as today, events, interviews, articles, as well as through a website and social media communities under the appellation St. Julian's Crossing Wildlife Habitat, which is the name adopted for her family's monarch way station. Professor Simpson is a member of local chapters of the Native Plant Society of Texas, Native Prairie Association of Texas, and the North American Butterfly Association. She has also received Level 1 and Level 2 certifications through the Native Plant Society of Texas Native Landscape Certification Program, has attended the Monarch Conservation Workshop training, and she also chairs the subcommittee for the Advocacy Companion class to NLCP Level 4 of the Native Plant Society of Texas. And if that doesn't impress you enough, just on the side, Professor Simpson is a clinical associate professor at the University of Houston Law Center, where she teaches lawyering skills and strategies. She is a spring 2016 recipient of the University of Houston Texas Excellence Award. She's one of 3 2018 AALS Teachers of the Year, which is selected by UH's Law Center. And she's the 2017, 2018, 2019, 2021, and recently 2022 Student Bar Association Professor of the Year for Law Center faculty teaching in the part-time program. So we're of course very honored to have you with us, Professor. Thank you for your time. Thanks to all of you for attending. And with that being said, I will pass the baton to you.
Thank you so much. I really want to thank Anietie Akpan and Lucy Fisher-Kane with HYLA, and HYLA, especially its Generation Generosity Committee, for having this series of talks. As Anietie said, it's so important for us to be involved in the community in general, just as we, being officers of the court, we support and promote our own legal community and serve those who have legal needs. But our service requirement is really broader than that, right? We're role models for the community around us. And so I take my hat off to HYLA and this committee and other committees. I encourage folks to get involved with those service committees. HYLA has several, and I'm thrilled to be here today and really honored. So there are a couple of handouts. I think, Anietie, you just put that in the chat, the link to that.
I'll put it in right now. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
So I have created 2 handouts for this talk. They're PDFs, and they're going to be available in the Google Dropbox that Ms. Akpan is going to put in the chat in a moment. So the first one is simply a flyer for St. Julian's Crossing Wildlife Habitat, which is our home gardens. It explains how we, what our gardens are like, why we do it, how we do it, and then has resources on the back. The other handout is tailored particularly for this talk today. I'm going to give you a series of 4 to 5 tips, depending on our time, maybe a bonus 6 if there's time. And that handout is organized with online resources that are super helpful for each of those tips, plus a bibliography of recommended texts if you want to follow up. It also has my contact information under the Appalachian St. Julian's Crossing Wildlife Habitat if you had any questions for me. Again, you saw the comment in the chat about seeds. So I'm putting together 3 different species of native plants, flowering plants. So wildflowers, I suppose you could call them, from my own home gardens with instructions. And so HYLA is generously offered to get those to y'all. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Ooh, it worked. And there was much rejoicing. All right. Okay. So serving our community by supporting pollinators at home. So what I really wanted to start with is letting you know that with the exception of those few photographs that are marked as having a different source, every single one of the photos that you see of flora or fauna in this presentation are taken by me with my little cell phone in our home wildlife habitat gardens. And this is from, I think, 2021. This is a view of our front gardens. It's about 90% species that are native to our ecoregion here in this part of Texas. And that diversity of native plants has resulted in the diversity of flora, of fauna, of insects in particular, and pollinators among them that you're going to see today. And here's the beautiful thing about that. If you build it, they will come. And so the more native plants that I incorporated and the bigger my gardens got, the more species of insect that you will see today in these photos arrived. So I just wanted to point that out at the start. So I'm going to break this talk into 3 parts, sort of the what, why, and how of gardening for wildlife or wildscaping. So let's start with the what. So I think it's important to explain our terminology at the beginning. So a wildscape, unsurprisingly, is simply a garden with the primary purpose of supporting wildlife. So that's pretty self-evident from the name. And by the way, some people call them wildlife habitat gardens or habitat gardens. I tend to use the word wildscape, same thing. So let's unpack that meaning a little bit. This means that every choice I make in plant species, in garden design, and then afterwards in maintenance of the garden, have this goal that you see on this slide in mind. 100%, every choice I make in those 3 areas is geared with understanding how insects and the wildlife that depends on them feed and nest and shelter. And I make decisions with those things in mind. In a suburban or urban area, so at our home, at our businesses, in our green spaces, this kind of gardening it's not like the traditional gardening that we see, but it's not ecological restoration. And I think it's important to spend a moment on that. So ecological restoration, we absolutely have to have. So that's what's happening out on the west of Houston at places like the Katy Prairie Conservancy, where they are actually trying to reconstruct and save and then expand on the coastal Gulf prairie that was here before humans came in and started building cities like Houston. And so that has a place, and an important place. It's just that in places like Houston and Galveston and other cities, humans are already here and we have already taken up space and we have already fragmented that habitat. So how we do things is a little bit different from ecological restoration. It's also different from ecological restoration in that we live in communities of human beings. And I cannot emphasize this enough. When we garden for wildlife at home, we are ambassadors to the wider community, including our neighbors, for this type of gardening. And therefore, it has to read garden in the phrasing of Rainier and West, whose book I'll show you later. If I put the absolutely authentic Katy Prairie in my front yard, I'd be happy as could be. But my neighbors would probably rebel because it doesn't feel like a garden to them. And so we have to signal in it that it is actually intended, as one of my friends said, rather than untended. And therefore, this is more of what they call a designed plant community, or a hybrid of horticulture and ecology. This is a garden that translates the wild and native plant communities in our coastal prairies into something that can be interpreted as a garden at home and therefore embraced by the community. And we'll talk about some of those techniques for making it both about critters and community. But here's the rejoice and be glad moment, y'all. Your garden can still look like a garden and be understood and accepted by people while being 100% supportive for wildlife. So we'll talk about that in a bit. I always feel like a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so what I've done is gotten permission from several of my friends involved in the Native Plant Society and other groups, and gotten their permission to show their gardens. And you can see that I think this is another big takeaway that I want folks to understand. That this kind of garden, it's not all or nothing. When I first started, I thought it had to be really wild looking or natural looking, but it can be as tailored as we want it to be. It's just those choices of plant design and maintenance. So it's a sliding scale, whatever your preference is and whatever works with your architecture and your community. So this is an example of a fairly traditional garden. It is, with the exception of some of the roses and a few other things, it is heavily plants that filled with plants that are native to our ecoregion. Therefore, it is highly supportive of the wildlife in our area. But look how traditional it looks. The homeowner uses mulch in between. The homeowner spreads things out. The homeowner uses hardscaping and distinct borders on the beds to separate it. So it is 100% supportive, but looks traditional. So let's look at something that's sort of a mix in the middle. So this is from my dear friend and mentor, Jaime Gonzalez. This is his family's home. So in the backyard, what I want to show you is a series of garden beds that look more wild or more natural, and yet they still read as a garden bed. So other than back here where there's actually a chunky border, there's no border here. But this uses a technique called green bordering or green edging. And what that is a sharp delineation between the contents of the bed and the ground in between. This is fantastic for a family, for example, where you might have kids running around or areas that you need to have space for seating and so forth. And this is their front yard. And what he does each year is he mounds up in a geometric pattern a series of mounds of soil, and then he embeds them with our native wildflowers so that all spring there are these beautiful shapes, zigzags and so forth of plants in their front yard. This is another example of a mix, sort of the middle of that spectrum. This is a former home of a friend down in Clear Lake, almost 100% species native to the ecoregion. The contents of these beds are fairly natural indeed, right? But look how that is offset with chunky borders. Those chunky borders help it read, garden, and be accepted by the community. And I would say that the wilder the contents of the bed, the more robust the bordering needs to be so that people can interpret it as that. So this is the wildest example, the most natural example that I'm going to show you. This is a friend's former home in the Montrose area. So there were no deed restrictions, all right? So she could do whatever she wanted, no HOA rules. I love this look, but this look is not for everyone. There actually are architectural moments in the garden, you just can't see them. So again, it's a whole spectrum, whatever your taste is. And now I'm going to show you my home gardens in the northwest part of Houston. So in Houston proper, not far from the 610 North Loop. And this is St. Julian's Crossing Wildlife Habitat. My garden beds are in the middle of that spectrum. Notice how everything is thickly planted. In the prairie, things are thickly grouped together. I don't use mulch for reasons that I'll explain later, but I don't have to suppress weeds because my native plants crowd them out and outcompete them. Notice the thick borders and the pathways and so on and so forth, some decorative items. So it is a sliding scale. If you hear nothing else, hear that today. It's not all or nothing. We have choices. Now let's continue the what by meeting a little bit those in our, that use our gardens, those critters that use our gardens, focusing first on pollinators as a subset of all insects. And there is a method to my madness, y'all. Some of the characteristics I'm going to talk about later, you'll see why that matters for how we design and how we maintain. So let's talk about bees. Everyone understands that bees are important for pollination and that they're in trouble right now. So I thought we would start with them. So each of these was taken in my garden. Now, this is a participatory class. So those who don't participate, and if you're my age, you'll understand this, have to stay after class to clean the erasers as I channel Tom Lehrer. All right, so here we go. Are you ready? I want you to hold up your pinky finger and I want you to look at the flesh part of your pinky fingernail. That is the size of this entire flower head, your pinky nail flesh-colored part. Therefore, this bee is smaller than that. And that is not the smallest bee in North America. The smallest bee in North America is called a fairy bee, a perdita, which is so cute. And it's only a couple of millimeters big. So some of these bees are very tiny indeed, and to the naked eye actually look like gnats. On the other hand, hold up your thumb, and I want you to look at the last knuckle to the tip of your thumb. And that's about the size, maybe a little bit smaller than the size of some of the largest bees. So that includes things like bumblebees, and like this right here on the left. This little gal is an eastern carpenter bee, Xylocopa virginica, very common in these neighborhoods. And so I just want you to see the range of size. They also come in greens and blues, black, red, orange, brown, white, all kinds of yellows on them. I mean, who knew, right? The other thing about bees is there are about 4,000 species in North America, if you count all of North America, and about 1,100 in Texas, because go Texas, we're biggest and best in all things, right? But the honeybee is not one of them. The honeybee is actually a domesticated insect brought over from Europe and other areas for honey production. So it's gotten out and it's feral, but it's not needed. So this is where what I want you to remember for later, okay? No test, but I'll let you off easy. Bees feed with tongues. So sometimes their tongues are longer or shorter, and they tend to have a lot of furry body parts, especially on the ventral abdomen and on the legs. And so they're really, really good at picking up pollen. So then everyone also knows that butterflies are also pollinators. And actually, they're not as good a pollinator as bees because they feed not with a tongue, but with something called a proboscis, which is sort of a long organ of the body that has a channel in the middle, but it doesn't actually function primarily as a straw. It functions more as sort of a sponge through capillary action. So they get on these flowers, especially the larger one, they unfurl that proboscis and they absorb the nectar, right? But their bodies don't always come in touch except for the legs and the proboscis. So they are pollinators, but not quite as good as bees. In our home gardens, and these are some of the most beautiful species, very common in my gardens, I just recorded last year our 52nd species of butterfly in our little gardens. And our house is under 1,600 square feet, and the front and backyards are proportional in size. And about 60% of my front yard is turned into gardens. How in the world do I have 52 species? So just understand that some of these butterflies are larger, some are smaller, but they feed with that proboscis. We also understand very easily, I think, that moths in the same family of lepidopteran species as butterflies are also pollinators. They tend to be a little fuzzier, maybe a little bit lower to the ground, okay, except for some large ones. I actually have no idea how many moth species we have because many of them feed at night. They're nocturnal feeders. These are some of the ones that are day feeders or diurnal feeders or that I've seen. So they are actually pretty good pollinators too, like butterflies. They feed with the proboscis and they're super important for pollinating at night. Now, we're getting into some of these insects that are pollinators that I knew nothing about. So the first thing is I knew nothing about how flies were pollinators. So here's the general rule of thumb. Any animal that while it feeds on the nectar or pollen of a flower, transfers the pollen from the male component of a flower to the female component of a flower, that's a pollinator. Anything that does that. And so flies also qualify because most flies feed on nectar and maybe a little bit of pollen. They have a little bit of a different mouth part. There are actually 3 different types of mouth parts because some of them are predatory or predaceous feeders. But many of those that you see here have a little mouth part that's short, it comes out on a little stalk and has a spongy tip. So they do better with flowers that are shallower, right? It's easier to get that nectar and not as deep. The other cool thing about flies, besides their being beautiful, is that some of them in their larval stage are actually predaceous and they help keep my garden balanced and healthy from insect pests without the use of pesticides. I haven't used pesticides in like 6 years. So this species here, this one here, and this one here, they all have larvae that are predaceous. And these are in the family called hoverflies. And so we get 2 for 1, right? We get pollinators when they're adults, and when they're larvae, we get feeders. And in fact, depending on the species, a single hoverfly larva can consume 200 to 400 aphids before it pupates. That's, I mean, for reals, right? They eat scale, mealybugs, whiteflies, aphids, huge part, and bang for the buck. Not all of them, but many. Now, I am one with wasps. I am one with wasps. So we're all kind of afraid of wasps a little bit, and they get kind of a bad rap, but wasps are also pollinators, and that's because the majority of adults, so the adult phase of their metamorphosis, feed on nectar and pollen, primarily nectar. The thing that's really great about wasps is that their larvae, their babies, primarily feed on other insects. And so, by the way, with bees and wasps, only the females have a stinger. The males don't have stingers. So first 50% of them can't even sting you. The females have a stinger to paralyze the insect prey and then stock the larder in the nest for when their eggs hatch and their babies need something to eat. They are extremely good at keeping your gardens free from other insect pests. As Dr. Doug Tallow, who's an entomologist I'll introduce later, says, insects are really good at taking care of their own. So they pollinate, and then they also help keep our gardens healthy. And look how beautiful. Who knew they could be iridescent blue and green? For reals, right? Isn't that gorgeous? And then everything else. Remember, any animal that transfers that pollen while feeding. So I like to say the 4 Bs: beetles, bugs, bats, and hummingbirds, anything that feeds and transfers. So now we're going to shift from the what, and we're going to go into the why. Because I always feel like, you know, it's one thing to say we should change our gardening and give people a lot of shoulds, but we need to tell them why it's important, because why ask people to do something if they don't understand? I use that in my teaching for legal writing, and I also explain it here. So if you look at it in just a self-interested way, and this is a fantastic study from 2006, insects actually provide us billions of dollars a year in our continental US alone in eco-services, and it runs the gamut. And by the way, when these researchers did this study, they didn't look at honeybees because they're not native, and there's a lot of data on honeybee production and so forth. They looked only at our native insects, insects that are native to the continental US, and they understood that the number that they came up with was low. So it's actually higher than this, right? So first off, pollination. So we talked about those insects that pollinate, which is a subset of insects. So about 2/3 of our crops, and that translates into about 1/3 of what's on our dinner plates every day, right? On our meals every day, requires some kind of animal pollination to propagate, to produce those seeds, berries, and nuts. And depending on the metric you look at, even beyond crops, of flowering plants, anywhere from 75 to about 95% require some kind of insect pollination. So they're not wind pollinated, for example. So we need them for future generations of these flowering plants. They're also extremely important for the food chain. So first, indirectly, by pollinating, for those insects that pollinate, they ensure that there are things like seeds, berries, and nuts going forward, depending on the plant, for those mammals, reptiles, other insects, birds that feed on those things. But directly, they're actually very nutritious. So insects pack a lot of protein. And they're really critical for the food chain. And in fact, certain of them, like butterfly and moth caterpillars, actually are high in fats, and they're highly craved by things like birds. So I'm going to give you just one example to show you how important they are. And this comes, I'm going to introduce you to these books by Dr. Doug Tallow. Bringing Nature Home was his first one a little over 10 years ago. And so he talks about the importance of insects for feeding birds. So adult birds feed, you know, a certain portion of their diet, maybe it's like 1/4 is insects, but primarily they can eat other things like berries, right? Nuts, seeds, grains. They can eat a lot of different things. So most of them will supplement with insects, but they're not necessarily dependent only on insects. Okay, that's not true for their babies. So he talks about studies, and you can see some of the other sources for this at the base. He talks about studies where researchers tried to figure out, you know, how many, so for example, birds, so anyway, let me back up. I'm getting ahead of myself here. There's not enough coffee for this time of day, right? Okay, so while only insects supplement the diet of adult birds, that's not true for our terrestrial birds' chicks. So about 96% of the terrestrial bird species, their chicks can consume only insects and other arthropods. They cannot digest the grains, seeds, and berries and nuts that their adult members of their species can. And so Dr. Tallow talks about these studies where they tried to figure, well, exactly how many arthropods, right? How many insects primarily do those chicks need? And so one of the studies he talks about, I think it's been duplicated now, is of Carolina chickadees. I think it was in the Northeast. And so they followed a single mama with a single clutch to kind of get data on that. And the numbers were staggering. So a single mama with a single clutch in a single season needs not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of insects or arthropods to feed her babies. And if there aren't enough insects or arthropods around, the babies either starve to death or the adults have fewer eggs and they reproduce less. Thousands. So it's hugely important. Insects also provide us decomposition services. So they decompose carrion, they help break down plant matter, they recycle dung. And when they die, their bodies release things like nitrogen or other minerals or whatever that helps nourish the soil. And also pest control. We talked about this before. And so they provide about $4.5 billion a year in pest control. Not just flies, but wasps, spiders, and things like that. So insects and other arthropods are hugely important to the chain of life. The thing is, and I think we've all kind of become somewhat familiar with this, that they're in a world of hurt right now. These are just some of the drivers of the decline in insects. And you'll see some sources on the next page if you want to follow up. The thing is, the drivers of insect decline are complex. They're interwoven, and they're just starting to be understood in the last few decades primarily, okay? Nonetheless, scientists are already, primarily entomologists, they can see the writing on the wall, and they know it's bad. And anytime an entomologist takes off that white lab jacket, right, and comes out in the middle of research, knowing that they don't have all the data and they may never have it all, and says, we have a problem that we can see now and it's extremely bad, then we need to listen. Okay, so they explain it as, in some of the sources that you can see down here, as death by 1,000 cuts. They talk about serious declines in insects' abundance, diversity, and biomass worldwide. And they are calling for action now while they are still collecting data at all levels: international, national, state, city, and individual. Over and over, they're asking us to do this, and we need to pay attention when they do. I'm going to give you just one piece of information, because we could talk about this for a week, and I have 1 minute. So let me just make it very quick. There was a great article from June of 2019. You can see it in the handout that Anietie gave you in the link. It was an article called "The Great Insect Dying, the Tropics in Trouble, and Some Hope." It was published by Manga Bay News in 4 different parts. And in one of them, they actually interviewed 24 entomologists representing 12 different countries. And they asked them one question: how would you rate, on a scale of 0, no trouble, to 10, dire, the insect abundance crisis? This is back in 2019. None of the 24 scored it at lower than an 8. So 8 and above, and some put it at a 10. So there is no way to sugarcoat this. It's extremely bad. And among those drivers that's really bad is habitat fragmentation and degradation, which we do in our cities. So I don't know about you, but after that Debbie Downer moment, I need a rejoice and be glad moment. Are you ready for that rejoice and be glad moment? Here it is. Right here, right now, right in our own gardens, we form a critical link in the chain that will save insects and thus the ecosystem. Right here, right now, right at home. And we all know how a chain works, right? It is as strong only as the strength of every individual link. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend like we don't have to take action at the international, national, state, and municipal level. We absolutely have to, even with our HOAs, to help educate. But some of those things are less direct than the individual level. Now let's flip that coin. This also means that I have control over a critical link, and that is my actions at an individual level. By making choices in my garden that support insects, I am helping that chain. And I don't know about you, but that and a cup of coffee gets me going in the morning. That is highly motivational. It was to me. And when I realized that simply by the choices that I make in my garden, I could positively affect insects and help counter their decline, it completely changed my worldview. And I'd already been doing this kind of education for a few years. It's amazing. When we do this at our home, we create what these researchers here call stepping stones, or others like Dr. Tallow speak of as biocorridors. Remember, we talked about that one stressor being fragmentation of habitat. So Houston's not going away. We're staying here, and this is our home. But and that means we don't have a lot of big green spaces. There's not the wide coastal prairie that there used to be. But what we have are individual patches of green at our own home. And Dr. Tallow in Nature's Best Hope, his book that was published, I think, in 2021, talks about something he calls homegrown national park. And that is by converting the land, our own property, and instilling these kinds of gardens in them, even if it's only a small percentage, we are creating this wildlife corridor for critters to move around. Remember how tiny some of those bees are and some of those flies, like a couple of millimeters. And wasps too can be that small. So there's no way they're getting from my pollinator patch in Northwest Houston over to Memorial Park. But by gum, they can get to my next door neighbor's patch, then 3 houses down, and then 2 houses down from that. So we create stepping stones. And I like to say to people, yeah, the bigger the garden, the more biodiverse. I choose to have big gardens because I use it as an educational platform. But even if it's small, let's say a space 5 by 5 or 10 by 10, I think in a way it's more important that we have the right kind of garden using the right kind of maintenance techniques than that we have giant gardens. We need to be realistic in our time. Start small. And if we're working 70, 80-hour weeks, we don't have time for 60% of our front yard to be garden. But we may have time for a small patch in a single bed. But you're still creating a stepping stone. Pretty awesome, right? Okay. So now, before we transition to the how, I wanted to introduce you to those books about which I've been speaking already. So we have Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Best Hope. They are both written by Dr. Doug Tallow, entomology professor. I forget where, I don't have it in my notes. But anyway, he's amazing. He's awesome. Very easy to read. He does not write like what you might think would be some kind of scholarly piece or something that entomologists might write. Very engaging and approachable. Bringing Nature Home issued more than 10 years ago, I think. Nature's Best Hope within the last couple of years. It's a follow-up on it. I would recommend both, but if you're going to choose one, I would choose Nature's Best Hope because it's more recent and more current and has more current data. Now, we've talked about the what, we've talked about the why, and now let's spend the last, Anietie, maybe 25 minutes, is that what we have left-ish, talking about the how. And again, I'm going to organize this by tips. Before I do though, wait, there's more. I have a few books to recommend for you. So some of us might be experienced gardeners, other of us might be novices. And so I'm going to introduce you to 3 books, at least one of which will fit your level. On the left-hand side, The Living Landscape. This is where Dr. Tallow joined up with native plant landscaper Richard Dark, and they created this book. If I'm a beginning gardener, I want The Living Landscape. So it takes the why, and it gives you advice for how to design a garden like that and how to do it and what the mechanics are. Very, very helpful. If you have a little more experience, or you just want to get a book so that when you have more experience, it's there, I recommend Planting in a Post-Wild World. And this is the Rainier and West I introduced you to at the beginning. So this really talks a lot about design. And I will say this about that book, Rainier and West. They are not proponents of 100% native plants to your ecoregion, but they do acknowledge that all of their design techniques work 100% with native plants, and you can get more biological, ecological bang for the buck with natives. So I like this book, even though I disagree with their philosophy on, don't worry about whether it's a native plant or not. It's still a great book. And finally, like this is way above my pay grade even. I'm still slowly getting through it and I use it more as a reference book. Phenomenal. Larry Weiner and Thomas Christopher's Garden Revolution. Very specific. So this is like top level. If you're unsure about this one, I would recommend going to a library and looking at it, or maybe getting an e-version, or email me. Maybe you can borrow my copy, but definitely it's the highest level, but I love it. Okay, so tip number one, if I could give you just one tip, I would give you this tip, and we would call it done, seen, the end. Support the home team. And when I say support the home team, I mean plant plants that are native to our part of Texas. So let's unpack that and talk about what that means. So the first thing that I discovered when I started this process back around 2015 is that there's actually debate about what constitutes a native plant. A lot of different views. Some are, well, if it was here in North America, in our continent before Europeans came, others are if it's X number of centuries old. But I like Dr. Talamy's understanding of it. And that is that it's a function of time, place, and community. So plants that have historical evolutionary relationships with a particular wildlife community. So let's break that apart. Time. So this means that the plant has grown in this particular spot for a really long time. Not decades, not centuries, but millennia. And why? Because over that kind of time frame, you can have things that co-evolve with it, other flora and fauna, so that it becomes a supportive web. Does that make sense? So time is ancient, like a long time, eons, millennia. Place. The plant has been here for a long time, in a place that has similar characteristics, rainfall, sunlight, soil, topography, etc. Okay. And finally, it's part of a community that has learned to sort of like give and take with it, right? Both other plants and animals. There's no such thing as a native plant in the abstract. That makes no sense. There's no native plant qua native plant. It's always contextual, right? So something that's native in Europe is native there, but it's not native here. So that idea of time, place, and community, so that we get the most ecological bang for the buck in the plants that we choose. Our ecoregion here in the greater Houston area is the Gulf Coast Prairies and Marshes ecoregion, which actually has sort of sub areas in it. This is available in Texas Parks and Wildlife Department's website. So you can see that Houston is included, in fact, pretty much all of Harris County. And this is, there are marshes as we get closer to the estuaries and the ocean, but there's also just a lot of prairie. So there are different types of prairies, but this is where we are a prairie that has certain characteristics that make plant choices here really great for your home garden. So now that we know, kind of have a feeling for what, and let me say this too, hold on one second. So Texas is huge, like it's about the size of France. So the conditions in West Texas and in the Panhandle, and even down in, the area in the very south of Texas, are not necessarily going to be those conditions that are here. So just because you walk into a nursery and it says Texas native, like what part of Texas? See, that can matter. Something that's used to being, having desert-like conditions way out in West Texas is not going to do great here where we have a ton of rainfall in the spring. It's going to rot and I'm going to waste my money. And it may be, but it may not be as supportive for the critters for reasons we'll talk about on the next slide. So on the handout with the tips, I've given you a list of resources. If I see a plant, how do I know it's from my county, my area, it's native to there or elsewhere, and you have those resources. And I also gave you resources for, I have no idea what plants I want. Give me a list. And so you've got both of those in the handout. Okay, so why is it that we should focus on those native plants that are native to our particular area? There are many reasons. But the first one, I think, is that as a general rule of thumb, they can generally feed more critters. So let's unpack that for a little bit and talk about why that's so. So again, I'm going to focus on insects for the moment, right? Okay. So at some point in their development, about 90% of insect species, and I mean species of insect that feed on plants, so phytophagists, are what we call specialists at some point in their life cycle. So what do we mean by specialists? So a specialist is an animal that can feed on only the leaf or pollen, depending on what's relevant, of those plants in a particular family, genus, or even species. There are some bees, for example, their babies eat pollen, the adults eat nectar with a little pollen, so the babies primarily eat pollen. There are some that are so specialized in their coevolution with certain plants that their larvae, their babies, can feed only on the pollen of a single species. So that's unusual, but it's possible. And 25 to 35-ish% across are some kind of specialist, maybe to genus. Okay. So very often it's in the larval phase of the insect's development. And a good example of this is, you see it a lot in butterfly and moth caterpillars, for example, not uniquely, but there's a lot of specialization. A good example is the monarch butterfly. So we've probably all heard that monarchs, caterpillars eat milkweed. Well, milkweed is in the genus Asclepias. So pretty much with very few exceptions, that's all they can eat. And if you give them something else from a different genus, they're not going to be able to consume it. Okay, so that's what we mean by specialists. It's not that specialist insects can eat only those plants in the family genus or the family or genus that come from North America, because there might be, for example, the black swallowtail butterfly, a very common butterfly around here. Some of the host plants, the food plants for their caterpillars, are things like dill, parsley, fennel, Queen Anne's lace. Well, these are European. They're in the right family of plants, right, to be a host plant, but they're just not they're not native to our area. But we do have native equivalents. But the further away you get from our region or our area, the more likely that plant is going to have some kind of chemical in it, even if it's in that family or genus. That's a little bit of a deal breaker for our specialist insects. Do I have to, geek out and memorize exactly what insects at which stage eat which native plants and all? Not really. If I focus on plants that are native to here, I'm going to check a whole bunch more boxes than if I have plants that are not from here. Does that make sense? Not 100% deal breaker, but it can be. And then think of those little bees, those few of them that can feed the pollen of only one species. That's a deal breaker for them. That's a deal breaker. Okay. In fact, in one of those studies at the bottom, the 2018 study, they found one of the findings was that ecosystems dominated by non-native plants are characterized by reduced insect diversity, abundance, and biomass because they can't eat it. And if you think about it, a lot of the plants that we see in horticulture that you see in big box stores, they are brought in because nothing eats them. That's why they exist. But to paraphrase Dr. Tallow, if a plant's not feeding something, it's not doing its job. It's not doing its job. Okay, so they, as a general rule of thumb, can feed more critters. You don't have to think about it. Set it and forget it, put it in. They're also hardier in our climate, right? So they're used to being drowned in the spring and nuked in the summer. That means I spend less money on water if I choose drought tolerant natives. It also means that I don't have to replace them as often. When I first started gardening, I planted all the wrong things and I was constantly replacing them, and ka-ching, it was expensive. And finally, there are prairie plants. I'm talking about prairie plants in particular, are particularly good at sequestering carbon, which was new to me only in the last few years, and purifying water. And plants' roots do this anyway, but our prairie plants, some of them have roots that are 12 to 14 feet deep. Not just the grasses, but some of the flowering plants as well. That's deeper than a human adult is tall. As a general rule of thumb, the deeper the root, the more carbon and water it can sequester. And at a 2018 conference put on by the Katy Prairie Conservancy and the Houston Audubon Society, I spoke at that. Another speaker was saying, a St. Augustine lawn can absorb in an average rainfall maybe like ½ inch of rain. But a full-on prairie with those deep roots can absorb inches of water in an hour, as opposed to a ½ inch in an hour. So I don't have a literal prairie, but I have a lot of plants with deep roots, and they're sequestering carbon and water. And they generally keep that water below ground, as opposed to trees, which have sequestered the carbon a lot in the trunk, which are great sequestrators of carbon, but if the tree burns, it's released. Prairie plants are used to being trampled by buffalo and burned with periodic prairie fires. So a lot of their oomph is stored in the root, including their carbon. Great carbon sequestration in this era of climate change. And it's also okay if they get out. If an aggressive native plant gets out, it was already here, right? The system is used to dealing with it. Not so for aggressive non-native plants if nothing here can eat them and keep them in check, or if very little can. One horrible example is the Chinese tallow tree, brought here in 18th or 19th century. I can't remember, it's been here for a while for various reasons, but it used to be put in a lot of landscaping. And indeed in my neighborhood, I once counted at least 12 trees. So the problem with the Chinese tallow is, I don't know anything here that eats it. Anecdotally, I can say I see nothing eating it. So the chemical in the leaf is foreign to our insects that would keep it in control. It's prolific. Birds eat the berries and they excrete them as they fly around. It has an incredibly deep root. Look at the seedling root on the right there. Can you imagine when that's full grown? And they grow fast and tall. And this species alone is responsible for killing prairie ravens. So if you have a Chinese tallow, I highly recommend you get rid of it. But the bottom line is, it's not that I'm a hater of non-native plants. About 10% of mine are non-native, but none is invasive. An invasive non-native plant do not have that. And I'm going to give you a few examples that I did not realize were invasive. This comes from Houston Audubon Society's list and a few others. Chinese tallow, Bradford pear, Nandina, those pretty little bushes with the orange berries. They're considered invasive by several sources, and those orange berries are cyanide-based, and they kill birds. They're bad news. Get rid of them or at least cut the berries off. Ligustrum, elephant ear, pampas grass, Chinese privet, and Japanese honeysuckle. These are problematic. They get out and they outcompete our natives and displace them. And remember, when our natives are displaced, things that have co-evolved to use them and to survive on them are in trouble. Okay, so that was my most important tip. The rest go a little faster. So Anietie, how am I on time? About 10 more minutes?
Yes, Professor. Yeah, I'd say between like 8 to 10 minutes.
Perfect.
Is good if that works for you. Mm-hmm.
Perfect, perfect. So I'm going to go a little faster on these, y'all. So the second is avoid pesticides. Like I said, I haven't used any since 2016. I highly recommend this book by Jessica Walliser, Attracting Beneficial Bugs to Your Garden. I like it because she introduces us to our different predators and parasitoids. And she also explains what plants to plant to attract them so that they lay their eggs and they get rid of your garden pests. And she has garden design sketches, which I think are great. So how do we keep our gardens from being decimated if we don't have pesticides? And the answer is we welcome parasitoids and predators. We do this by not using pesticides, which are equal opportunity killers. And we do it by having a lot of the same flowering plants that we have for our pollinators. Why? Because many of the adults of predators either eat only or supplement their diet with nectar and pollen. So these are examples of some of those insects. And I'll skip over that one in the interest of time. Tip number 3, mix it up. So mix it up. Variety is the spice of life, and it's also the best for our insect visitors. Remember earlier, I told you there was a method to my madness. We talked about how those different insects feed. With a long proboscis, they have big bodies, small bodies, with a tongue, with a spongy, shallow mouth part. Because there are a variety of ways to eat and a variety of sizes, we need a variety of nectar and pollen sources. Plus, it looks pretty. So first, I want to choose flowers of different sizes and colors. Different sizes, because if I'm a big old monarch or one of those big old swallowtails, I need a landing pad to land on probably. So something that has a big flower head might be easy for me. I also need some that are shallow in their flowers, right? So that those with small mouth parts can still get to the pollen and nectar reward inside. I want a variety of different colors. So not only do insects see colors differently from how humans do, but insects see colors differently from each other. So bees, for example, are particularly good at seeing yellow, white, and purple. And they're not as good at distinguishing green from red, although mine have learned the red flowers in the garden that are yummy. Butterflies and hummingbirds, in contrast, are particularly attracted to reds. So do I need to be, you know, super dork and learn all the different colors that different insects like? No, I just plant a variety and it ends up looking pretty anyway. I also need to choose flowers with different structures, again, because their mouth parts are different. So some tubular flowers, some composite flowers, I'll come back to that. Umbelliform is like dill, parsley, milkweed, and mallow flowers. By the way, look at this little mama bee's pollinator pants, her pollen pants, right? Isn't that cute? All right, so composite flowers. So in composite flowers, they usually have what we call ray petals. And then what we think of as a single center, but it's not. It's actually dozens or hundreds of teeny little flowers without the big ray petals. And so it's kind of like when an insect lands on that. It's kind of like going to a shopping mall. They can get a whole bunch of different nectar pockets and pollen pockets without having to fly away, instead of having to drive to individual freestanding brick and mortar stores. So make sure you have shopping malls in your garden. You want to have composite flowers, so things like daisies, right? Things like asters. I also want to choose flowers that bloom in different seasons. The worst thing is to invite all of them in the spring and summer when it's easy to have flowering plants, and then have nothing in the fall so that they're hungry. So as you read the labels to check for things like light and water requirements when you're purchasing something in a nursery, also look to see when it blooms. 2 of the plant species I'm giving you bloom spring to summer, and 1 of them blooms in the fall. And they're different colors. So I'm trying to spice it up in that too. You also want to layer the plants in your garden bed. So there are 2 reasons for this. There's an aesthetic reason and a biological reason. The aesthetic reason is that it looks more intentional when we are very particular about having different layers. So in the center of the bed or at the back of a bed against the house, I want to have my taller plants with medium plants around it or in front of it, and then ground covers. Does that make sense? It looks more intentional. The biological reason is that different critters in different sizes, and this includes lizards, reptiles, amphibians, birds, small mammals as well, they shelter in different ways. And so some of them like to be high, some low, some are small, some are big, some climb, some fly. So by doing this, I kind of check all those boxes. Tip number 4, pile it up. By this, I mean that we want to plant species in clusters in our garden. A good rule of thumb that I've heard someone say before is we want to plant in odd numbered clusters. It looks more intentional, so 3s and 5s and 7s. So you can see here I have firewheel, Gaillardia pulchella. I have American germander, then I have some Texas coneflowers and some others. You see how they're kind of clustered in clumps there? So in the prairie, things get all mixed up, and that's gorgeous. And I have parts of my garden that are much more natural looking. Aesthetically, the more that we cluster the species like this together, and you can have, I have 1 cluster here and 1 cluster there, so it's not one and done, the more intentional it looks. To cluster gives the eye something to focus on, and it looks intended instead of untended. In contrast, if you want it to look more natural, just spread them out. So aesthetically, it helps it look more intentional. Biologically, there are some insects that practice what we call flower constancy. So certain bees, for example, and this means that they like to finish using the nectar and pollen in a certain species of flower before they move on. So when I put it together, it makes it easier for them. It also gives large patches of color so that overflying butterflies and hummingbirds can see them well. And probably the last tip we'll do today is embrace imperfection. So this goes to the maintenance part of it. Remember I said plant choice, garden design, and maintenance. So I'm inviting us to change our maintenance techniques a little bit so that we can be more beneficial to wildlife. So after a freeze, like we had in February of 21, right? First thing I want to do when I have all those brown stems and stuff is I just want to cut them all down. But I invite you not to do that. And here's why I invite you not to do that. About 30% of our native bees nest above ground, sometimes in crevices, sometimes in tunnels, but some of them that are really tiny will actually burrow into pithy and hollow stems. Like, who knew that, right? And some of our little native wasps will too. So they'll burrow in there and nest once or twice a year. And then they will also crawl into them to shelter during the cold of winter. So if I immediately cut back all those dead plants and I compost them, I might be composting, for lack of a better word, baby bees or baby wasps that would help keep my garden healthy. So I choose to leave them. And the other benefit is if I leave those stalks up, it gives me some architectural structure and interest where the plant used to be instead of just hacking it all down. When it's reliably above 50 degrees for at least a week, then I can start trimming. But I always inspect to see if there are nests inside. The other thing is that I tend to leave when I trim 1 to 2 feet of stalk in place, like you see here, so that those become the nesting stalks for future generations of bees. No one will see it when the plants grow up in the spring because they get hidden. The other thing that I do is I leave these little seed heads, like from my coneflowers here during the winter and fall, even when they die. And if I cut them off, I drop them on the ground. And the reason I do that is that overwintering birds and small mammals will eat them and sustain themselves during the winter. The other thing that I do is that I do not use commercial mulch because about 70% of our native bees, and I don't know what proportion, but a large proportion of our native wasps nest underground. See, honeybees are unusual. They're what we call truly social bees, and they nest in a hive. Bumbles are similar, but generally in the ground. But most bees are what we call some form of solitary nesting, where it's a single mama with a single nest chamber. And 70% of them nest in the ground. So if I put that thick mulch over it, I might be preventing bees from getting in and babies from getting out. Instead, if your deed restrictions allow it or your HOA allows it, I take spent leaves and I use them as mulch because critters can get through those. And they also, things like butterflies and lizards and frogs and birds will dig under them and nest and shelter in the winter. In the interest of time, I won't say how I select the leaves, but you can reach out to me and I can give you some examples. The other thing too is when leaves decompose, they fertilize the soil. Like I said, I haven't used fertilizers in maybe 5 years. I don't need to. The other thing is that early in the spring, we're just now starting to see our garden bed plants bloom, right? But early in the spring, sometimes the only thing we see are these little wildflowers in our yard. This is one of our native ones here. It's called crow poison, which is the worst name ever, but it's a fantastic little one. And this little gal, she has pollen pants again. She is a mining bee in Andrina, some of the earliest hatching ones. So I always say, when you get these little wildflowers in your lawn, just let them go. So don't mow as frequently. We didn't mow for about 3 months out front. And if it gets a little too unruly, then here's a little trick. Mow everything else, but leave a patch of them and put bricks around it so that it looks intended and not untended. These little wildflowers, until my garden bed plants really started blooming, this was all my critters had to eat as they hatched. And we're not going to worry about stock the nursery. That's a bee in a nesting hole. Isn't that cute? Okay, we're not going to worry about that. In the interest of time, I'm going to wrap up. I want to thank you. I want to thank HYLA, Generosity Committee, and happy wildscaping, y'all.
Oh my gosh, Professor, that was wonderful. What a beautiful presentation. Thank you. We need to do like a part 2 of this because I know there's so much to discuss and not enough time to capture it all. But in addition to just thanking you for your time and sharing your heart and passion for this work with us, I did just want to touch on when we were talking about this presentation, that you're in the process of doing some research on sort of the legal parameters impacting this type of conservation work. And we'll definitely be in touch with you about that, because I think that's something that a lot of us would be interested in learning about, is on the law side, what's sort of governing this space and the work within this space.
Exactly.
So interesting how it impacts the economy, as you were mentioning, food shortage. So thank you just again for your time, for the offer to share these curated seeds with us. We all promise to take good care of them. I'm going to try really hard not to kill the plants. And just one last thing to everyone who attended, thank you all so much for coming. The committee's companion project to Professor Simpson's great presentation is a service event at Beauty's Community Garden in the Independence Heights neighborhood. That's going to be this Saturday, March 26th from 9 to 11. Professor Simpson will be there. Several members from South Texas College of Law, Environmental Law Society will be there. So big thanks to their president, Sandra Fuentes, for helping with those coordinating efforts. And we just want to wish all of you a happy spring, stay safe. And we hope you're inspired by the great words that Professor Simpson shared with us all. So reach out if you have any questions. And otherwise, we hope to see y'all Saturday or at a future HYLA event. Thanks,
and
everyone.
I'll bring seeds on
and Professor will be bringing seeds. Oh, thank you. More seeds for everyone. Thanks, y'all. Take care. Thanks, Professor.